Good morning. This is Jeanette Wilson. I am a Senior Marketing Manager at Microchip Technology, and I'm here today to speak with you about Platform Firmware Resiliency. This is part of the Microchip Shields Up webinar series designed to build confidence and security with Microchip. The abstract for this talk is really a series of questions. Does your system boot from a SPI Flash? And if it does, if you boot from an external SPI Flash, how do you protect your system from risk during the boot process and during firmware updates? How does your system detect and recover from corrupted Flash files? And today we're going to talk about the NIST 800-193 guidelines for platform firmware resiliency, which will help answer how to protect and detect your system that boots from an external SPI Flash. Let's start with a few definitions. The first one is system resilience. Now, this is just for the system, and the definition is the capability of a system with specific characteristics before, during, and after a disruption to absorb this disruption, recover to an acceptable level of performance, and sustain that level for an acceptable period of time. This definition comes from the International Council of System Engineering, but essentially what it's saying is, how does a system respond to some type of an event? How does it recover from that event? And how do you ensure that you will have acceptable performance after the event occurs? If we take that definition and we apply it to the cyberspace, then the definition for cyber resilience becomes the ability to anticipate, withstand, recover from, and adapt to adverse conditions, stresses, attacks, or compromises on systems that include cyber resources. So in other words, when our system may be at risk of corruption from malware, whether intentional or through a power glitch, how does that cyber system able to respond to that corruption and to recover to a state of known good integrity? Let's talk about a few more definitions. Remember, this talk is about platform firmware resiliency. We just talked about cyber resiliency. Let's talk about the platform. And when we're talking about the platform as it pertains to electronics and high technology systems, it's the hardware and it's the firmware that's necessary to initialize components and boot the system. All of this happens before the operating system can be loaded. So this is when you first power on the system, all of the different things that have to bring power up before your operating system will start to run and take over control of the system. There's actually several different components that are comprised of the platform. And these devices you can see we have listed here, but they're going to provide the capabilities and the services that the host processor and that the operating systems and applications will use. Some examples of these could be an embedded controller that may be controlling power management, environmental monitoring, et cetera. It could be a trusted platform module, which you're using for security capabilities. It could be the baseboard management controller or a management engine if you have those in the systems. But typically, what you're also going to see is the storage and the network controllers. How do you store your data? How do you store your code? Is it a hard disk drive? Is it a solid state drive? What about the network? Do you have network connectivity? Do you have graphics in the system? And then there's also things like your serial peripheral interface or SPI Flash, power supplies, et cetera. So all of those devices will typically turn on first thing in the system and be up and running before the operating system will then take over functionality of the system. So we talked about system resilience. We talked about cyber resilience. We talked about the platform and what it's comprised of. Let's talk about platform firmware. So of those devices we just talked about, this firmware is very critical to the trustworthiness of a system. And the reason for that is because these are the things that are going to start first. So they're very privileged in terms of system architectures. They often have times to update firmware. They often have the ability to change settings in the system. And they're also very difficult to repair because this firmware is necessary for the system to operate. So how do you repair something when you're using that firmware for the system to run? So platform firmware has a very unique role in the system, and it's very important that we provide platform firmware resiliency. So let's talk about what could actually happen if you have a successful attack on the platform firmware. The worst case is that you could render a system completely inoperable, perhaps permanently. Essentially, you have bricked this piece of equipment so that it no longer can perform the duties that it was intended to perform. A successful attack could also inject persistent malware. It could put malware in there, and again, it's very difficult to detect, and it will linger in there, making it very difficult to remove from the system. It could extract data. You could inject malware into a system and use it to extract data throughout the system as the system is going about its business. It could require reprogramming by the OEM, such that maybe you have to ship it back to the original manufacturer, such that you may have to take it to a service bay just to have it reprogrammed and brought back to its initial state of integrity. And it could have significant disruptions to the users because now you're out of the use of this platform, you're out of the use of the resource, and potentially it's done even more damage down the line. So significant disruptions to the users. What that means is that the impact, not only on the platform level, if widespread, could actually impact your brand. We've all seen cases of or stories in the news about where a particular company gets hacked and it impacts their brand. It could impact the company. If you have to do a significant amount of reprogramming, if you have to do a significant amount of recalls, if you have to spend time and money trying to send out patches to fix these vulnerabilities, it could impact the resources of your company and your ability for R&D and for operating capabilities. Studies have shown that when you actually have a hack on your system, there is a direct impact to your revenue. That revenue hit may not happen immediately. It may happen as much as 18 months after the initial attack, because sometimes it takes people time, once they've had a hack on their system or seen a breach, to move to another competing solution. So it could protect or impact your revenue. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that could happen during a successful corruption was to extract data. It could impact your IP. You could actually have, competitors that are using this to get at your data to understand how to either incorporate it into their systems or use it as a way to compete against you. And your customers, we've already talked about, the impacts to the users, but it will definitely have an impact on your users if they have to clean up anything, if they have to reprogram it, et cetera. So the impact of a platform firmware attack is very significant, not only to you and your company, but to you, your company, and your customers and their livelihoods. As a response to a lot of the attacks that have been happening on the platform firmware, the NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, developed the Special Publications 800-193 for Platform Firmware Resiliency Guidelines. This set of guidelines was published in May of 2018, so it's still relatively new in terms of the adoption and the use of this. However, we at Microchip have seen a significant amount of customers asking for help supporting NIST 800-1-93 and their associated guidelines. So what does those guidelines entail? There are 3 tenets, and that is to protect the system, to detect the system when the platform code has been corrupted, and to recover. So let's talk about protection. As defined by the NIST 800-193 guideline, protection is what mechanisms are in place for ensuring that the platform firmware, the code, and the critical data remain in a state of integrity, which means that they are protected from corruption in the case of events. So you can do that by both authenticity and integrity of firmware updates. So not only during the boot up process, but also during the update process. The second tenet is detect. So you want to make sure that if you do have some type of a malware attack, you can detect when the code and the critical data of the platform firmware has been corrupted or otherwise changed. And the reason we say or otherwise changed is sometimes it's a power cycle that causes a glitch in the system. And how do you recover? How do you ensure that you are able to restore the platform firmware code and the data to a state of integrity such that you're able to recover through an authorized mechanism? And so the recovery is just limited to the ability to recover the firmware, the platform firmware, the code, and the critical data. So those are the three key elements of the NIST 800-193, protect, detect, and recover. Essential to those three tenets, they are based upon root of trust. And roots of trust are secure by design. They typically require some type of an immutable code to ensure the state of integrity, and they require some type of a digital signature to ensure the authenticity of the firmware. So remember, we talked about you protect through and detect through here, so we need to make sure that we're constantly in a state of integrity and that we can ensure the authenticity. There's several ways to implement the NIST Special Publications 800-193. Microchip actually has several examples of how you can utilize these guidelines in a scenario and make it very simple and easy to design with. One particular example, just to walk you through how you would actually do this protect, detect, and recover, is Microchip's CEC 1712 with the Soteria G2 firmware. This silicon and this firmware are designed to enable platforms, the platform firmware, to detect and to stop malicious firmware prior to the runtime. The CEC 1712 is an ARM M4 hardware-based microcontroller with a significant amount of hardware cryptography embedded into the device. We have support up to SPI-512. We have support for up to RSA 4096. We have the ECDSA curves, and we have several other curves that can be used, cryptography algorithms that can be used for whatever needs that your customers or you may require for your system firmware. The Soteria-G2 firmware, when used specifically with the CEC 1712, simplifies the code development for secure boot to make it very easy to adopt and implement a secure boot with an immutable root of trust. What the combination of these two devices or these two components do is they ensure that the code is authenticated before execution begins. So remember, when we talk about the platform firmware, we're talking about the things that are going to be turning on before the OS runs. So you want to make sure that the code is protected before execution. Typically, those types of events are called a rootkit type of attack or a bootkit. And so this solution will help prevent rootkit types of attacks, and they'll protect against these types of malware in systems that will boot from an external SPI Flash. This particular solution meets the NIST 800-193 guidelines, but it's also flexible and configurable to meet the platform needs. And it's very critical that any design that boots out of an external SPI Flash is able to protect, detect, and recover from impacts to the system. So how does this solution protect, detect, and recover? There's a lot of information on this slide. I'm just going to hit it very quickly. But essentially, in this particular system, we have a host processor that is going to boot from an external SPI Flash. And this host processor does not have the capability to do the immutable root of trust for integrity, nor does it have the ability to do the digitally signed algorithms to ensure the authenticity. In this case, the code starts execution with the CEC 1702 ROM. The read-only memory in here has a bootloader in immutable code, which means that it cannot be changed, and it is persistent even through power cycles. In the SPI Flash, you have a lot of different code that has been signed by the OEM's private key. In this, you're going to sign the code that the CEC 1712 will need to run. You're also going to sign the code that the host processor will need to run, whether it's a management engine that you have in your system, whether it's a host code that you have in the system, whatever that code is that is required by that host processor to run is what will be signed and stored in the SPI Flash. Now, in order for this to happen correctly, you need to make sure that the system does not fully execute. So in this case, the CEC 1712 will hold the host processor into reset. So by holding this processor into reset, it does not allow the host processor to fully boot up. The CEC 1712, again, has started with the ROM in here. We'll then go out to the SPI Flash, pull in the image from the SPI Flash into the SRAM in here, and then it will use the CEC 1712 public key that is stored in the one-time programmable memory to validate the image and the signatures of the image. If that image is encrypted, it will also decrypt that image and then allow it to start running. If for some reason this particular image has been corrupted, to do the recovery part of the system, we have detected that the signature is no longer valid. So then, once we've detected that, it will actually go get the other CEC image and load it into the SRAM and proceed, assuming that that digital signature has been validated as correct and authenticated. Once the CEC 1712 is up and running, then it will allow the host processor to start to load the code. So it will go through a similar process, and it will authenticate the host code in the SPI Flash with another public key that's stored in the one-time programmable memory. Again, assuming that the signature validation of the code has been authenticated, it will release that code and then move on to the next code to allow the system to fully power up. Once that it's all been validated, it will release the host processor from reset, and then the host processor is able to load and execute the SPI Flash. We use a very similar process during firmware updates. Again, before we will allow an update to occur, we will check using the bootloader and the digitally signed signatures to ensure that that code that is being sent over the air has been digitally signed with the correct private key from the OEM, and that we can prove its authenticity to allow it to run. Now, through this process, we actually talked about 3 particular steps where we have done the verification of the authenticity and the integrity of the system. So essentially what we've done is we have now created a chain of trust. We start with the chain of trust with the CEC 1712, and then use that to extend it to the management engine code and the host code that's in the system. And that is how we protect, detect, and recover. Now, in certain cases, we have customers that will require, and this is actually part of the NIST 800-193, is to be fully recoverable in a system. If an attack happens in a SPI Flash, it may end up corrupting an entire SPI flash. So to ensure complete recovery from a system, you need to make sure that you have full redundancy to the images with a second SPI flash, and that with the optional isolation logic, that you can actually restrict access to the SPI flash that has corrupted images. In other words, we have the ability, following the NIST 800-193 Platform Firmware Resiliency Guidelines, to remove completely the SPI flash that is corrupted from accessing the rest of the system. So just in summary, Platform Firmware Resiliency has three tenets: to protect the system, to detect when corruption has occurred, and to recover to a known good state of integrity. So in this particular example that we showed you today, the CEC 1712 plus the Soteria G2 firmware together will meet those guidelines to protect, detect, and recover, and they can be used to secure any processor that boots from an external SPI flash. The boot ROM is what provides your immutable root of trust, and that will be used with the digital signatures to authenticate the code in the SPI flash. All of this code is authenticated prior to any code running. It's also authenticated at every power cycle, and it's also authenticated during all of the secure updates. And if you would like to learn more information about this particular solution, you can visit www.microchip.com/CEC1712. And if you'd like to read more information about the NIST 800 Special Publication 800-193, you can download the Platform Firmware Resiliency Guidelines from the web, from the NIST website. So I thank you for your time today. And these Microchip Shields Up webinars run every other week, every 2 weeks. We are also translating these into languages for Asia specifically. So if your colleagues in other countries would like to learn more about this, please visit our website, microchip.com/shields-up, and you can learn more about our upcoming sessions. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.